Well, hello there. My name is Judy. I'll be your host for today, and welcome to another episode of Critically Curious. So I decided that I really want to try making more educational videos and informative videos on this channel, especially about some of the things that I was able to learn in college through my English degree. Some of the material that I'm going to cover comes from a course that I took in my senior year called Critical Theory, and this is what my former Korean beauty ideals video was based on. In this series, I want to break down these literary works and explain to you guys some of their theories as well as how it's still relevant today. For today's video, I want to talk specifically on the subject of eating disorders and women's body image through a feminist lens using the material of a feminist critical theorist, Susan Bordo. Now, even though this was written in the 1980s, I think that most of what she says can be applicable today, and we can even see how society might have shaped and shifted from Bordo's time in order to adjust to our own, and what sort of problems we might still face today, as well as some of the ways in which we might have improved. Now, just as a disclaimer, I want to warn you that there may be some material that can be triggering for some of you if you have suffered through eating disorders in the past, any form of disordered eating. And just because this material is from the 1980s, some of the subject matter and some of the language that Bordo uses will cater more towards traditional ideas of gender. So most of it I will be going straight from the material because I wanted to stay as true to the material as possible. In this video, I want to cover 3 of Bordo's essays from Unbearable Weight: Anorexia Nervosa, Psychopathology as the Crystallization of Culture, The Body and the Reproduction of Femininity, and Reading the Slender Body. With that being said, let's get started. Bordo herself does not get all of these theories and ideas from her own head. She refers to other previous source materials, and 2 authors that she mentions several times throughout this essay are Kim Sherman, who wrote The Obsession: Reflections on the Tyranny of Slenderness, and Michael Foucault, who theorizes that our body can be used as a political text or way in which society can imprison us. Cultural practices are already and always inscribed on our bodies and their materiality, their forces, energies, sensations, and pleasures. Our bodies, no less than anything else that is human, are constituted by culture. Bordo takes this idea of culture being inscribed on our bodies and applies a feminist lens to it, saying our cultural expectations of women's beauty ideals are inscribed literally onto our bodies. Anorexia isn't actually the only way. Other psychological disorders throughout history, such as hysteria and agoraphobia, were used as ways by male doctors to prescribe female patients who suffered through mental anguish and emotional distress. Now, the cultural prescription of social ideals on women's bodies is not exactly a new phenomenon. Throughout history, there have always been this separation between men and women in spheres of life and spheres of identity. Women have always been associated with the flesh, the body, emotions, whereas men have usually been associated with the mind or the intellect. And this just goes back to ancient times, and the ways in which women's bodies have been encouraged to be manipulated to fit certain cultural philosophies or ideas are actually just a symbol of power maintenance, according to Susan Bordo. Cultural prescriptions on the body were not necessarily limited to women in these times, it's just that women always received a bigger lashback. For instance, in the Victorian era, when sexuality and bodily pleasures became very repressed, actually beneath the surface in a lot of upper or upper middle class societies, the opposite became true, where both men and women who felt oppressed in their sexuality actually started exploring their identities more. Bordo calls this the impact of social practice. Social practice changed people's experience of their bodies and their possibilities. Throughout history, particularly in a lot of cultures and religions, the body has been seen as a source of temptation, desire, and so Bordo wants to argue that the culture of dieting in order to manipulate our bodies is just another cultural practice that shapes women's body ideals in contemporary society. The biggest issue that she highlights with anorexia in particular and eating disorders is not simply that men are trying to consciously oppress women in our society, and by now I'm sure many of us know that it is much deeper on a systematic level and a historical level. Bordo says the danger with anorexia and eating disorders is that it is a collusion between the oppressed and the oppressor, where sometimes neither of them even realize they are in this mind system. And the dangerous part is that because it is so normalized in society, you actually become willing to conform to these standards. Bordo really wants us to look at anorexia through 3 different axes, 3 particular lenses that we need to be mindful of philosophically and historically when we consider anorexia anorexia in women. The first axis is dualism. Dualism is a concept that goes back to Plato and is also enforced by Augustine and Descartes, that the body and spirit are these two separate ideas. I can't speak for all of them, but I think there are slightly different motivations and intentions behind why they make this distinction in their writings. Particularly for Augustine, why he sounds like there is this desire to cast off the burden of the body, and I don't actually think he thinks that the body is an evil thing, but the idea of dualism is what perpetuated in history the mind that we need to strengthen our minds and our wills against the body, against the flesh, and its desires need to be controlled by a greater part of ourselves, that is, the mind. And in anorexia, we see this being lived out. A lot of anorexic women found in her research spoke of their bodies as if it was alien to them, as if their body was what desired the food and had the hunger, but their minds were superior. Their minds wanted to cut that off. There is always this internal struggle within the mind of an anorexic person. But while this idea of dualism is important, Bordo actually goes on to say that in our society, it's become even more prevalent with what she calls the control axis. Our modern society's desire to control and manipulate our bodies. What Bordo discovered in her anorexia patients is that many of them didn't really start with this particular willingness to deprive their bodies of nourishment. It just started out as more of a casual diet or something triggered by someone's suggestion, maybe a comment about her weight, or even just a well-meaning person in their life who thought that they should have a healthier lifestyle. But somehow, in these particular women, things that started off as what could be a harmless lifestyle choice snowballed into this intense desire to control their bodies. And she quotes one of her patients where she says, "Her diet is the one sector of my life over which I and I alone wield total control." And this is tied back to the idea of dualism, the concept of wanting to master our bodies with our minds, as if that gives us a greater sense of control over our whole selves. And this is why eating disorders must be diagnosed as a mental illness, because so much of it is not really about our weight or our body at all, even though much of it can start with a simple dissatisfaction with our body image. In some ways, it's actually our mind's way of desiring power and control over ourselves when we feel helpless. And so many girls and women who undergo eating disorders have other insecurities, other anxieties, and other sources of stress in their life that can contribute to their desire for this control. Many women report feelings of being hooked on the feeling of mastering their bodies, almost like a chemical reaction to a drug. But for women in particular, I think it goes deeper than that because of where many of those insecurities and societal expectations can be rooted, which is how Bordo introduces the axes of gender. Now, just to remind you, I don't want to undermine the number of men who suffer through eating disorders just as much as women, but for the particular purpose of this video, I will be sticking more to the perspective of women just because of the statistics and the information that's provided from my source material. At the time of Bordo's writing in the 1980s, 90% of anorexics were women. And in Bordo's theory, this is due to the fact that the so-called tyranny of slenderness is gendered. And this is seen in numerous cultural icons and media, even back in that time, where women on TV and in movies always needed a certain kind of body type in order to have sex or romance appeal as a main character. And this is where the idea of powerlessness and lack of control ties in so much, because in much of society and history, women have been more vulnerable to that feeling of lack of autonomy over themselves. Now, on YouTube, there's actually been a popular resurgence of the idea of the male gaze versus the female gaze, which talks about the perspective in which we view women in media. But this concept goes back pretty far in time. In Bordo's research, many anorexic patients find themselves feeling as if there is this voice or this other person inside of them, that same voice wanting to control their physical self. And interestingly, in a lot of their minds, that voice is male. And at the same time, a lot of anorexic patients actually reported desiring a more boyish or slim figure with a lot of their feminine parts removed, such as the breasts or the hips. And that many adolescent anorexics expressed a desire to stay in their undeveloped figures, not to grow up into this womanly full body that can come about at the onset of puberty. And Bordo actually ties this to the first wave of feminism that was going on at this time, and how many young women in this age were actually afraid of becoming like their mothers, becoming domestic mothers or wives in the household, and not having that personal freedom to pursue their careers, their own dreams, the way in which first wave feminism was fighting for. And this great fear swept over all of society, and it was even seen in the media to make young women feel as if being in a domestic role was the most suppressing and terrible thing that could ever happen to them. But what's interesting is that, again, this dualism of women wanting to assert their own independence came about at the same time as women feeling these insecurities of feeling like they were too much, like their bodies or themselves were too much. And this is where she points out the biggest problem with eating disorder as a coping mechanism. As a feminist protest, the obsession with slenderness is hopelessly counterproductive. This will go more into her next essay, which talks about the woman's body as a cultural text, where it's literally inscribed onto our bodies our desire for power as well as our feelings of powerlessness. But in trying to conform to male standards of these things, we actually start to lose our power and feel even more powerless and spin out of control by protesting in this way. And she really does call this a protest on which our bodies are just a medium. And how sadly and unconsciously this grasp at control and power is what binds us even more to these cultural standards. We all wish that we could attain that ideal body without having to work for it so much effortlessly. And in the 1980s, this was particularly true, where the image of the ideal woman was someone so slender yet so carefree, embodying both the ideals of femininity as well as masculinity, being kind of tough and cool and able to hang with the boys, but still have feminine qualities to them as well that made them attractive. And the sad part is that no matter how effortless that can seem on media and on advertisements, just how much effort and even self-destruction it takes to achieve that image. What's startling for Bordo is how cavalier power relations are with respect to the motivations and goals of individuals, yet how deeply they are etched on our bodies and how well our bodies serve them. So how exactly is a woman's body a medium of culture? And what does that mean? Bordo uses Foucault's theory of how culture inscribes itself on our bodies as a sort of physical symbol, a literal symbol depicting what our society values. And she says it's the same with women's bodies, especially in the case of anorexia. The body is a medium of culture. It's a powerful symbolic form, a surface on which the central rules, hierarchies, and even metaphysical commitments of a culture are inscribed and thus reinforced through the concrete language of the body. The body is a canvas, and different languages can be etched and inscribed on it, which is a pretty interesting concept to think about ourselves as physical embodiments of what our culture prescribes. And she cites Foucault for something even more interesting, taking it to another level. For him, the body is a practical, direct locus of social control. Now, what the heck does that mean? So basically, Foucault is saying that how culture prescribes itself on our bodies is also the same way we maintain control over our society. The fact that culture lives in our bodies, this also dictates how our society runs. He really wants to hone in on this idea of practice over belief. And this is something I think can be tied to our modern day as well. In a nutshell, he's saying that actions speak louder than words, and that the practices that women underwent in response to these societal pressures and expectations of dieting, of manipulating our bodies, is what continued to inscribe that culture onto our bodies. Through these disciplines, we continue to memorize on our bodies the feel and conviction of lack, of insufficiency, of never being good enough. So the more we practice these things, the more they actually became ingrained and became natural to us. And in the 1980s, that was definitely true from all of the bombardment of advertisements and the media's portrayal of women. And now, because women are part of the workforce and part of this social sphere of life that they've never been able to be before, they have possibilities that they didn't have in pretty much all of history. They are having to adjust to this new role. And in doing so, they feel a need to go through certain modifications or go through certain practices in order to fit into that mold. And this, according to Foucault, is a result of social control that occurs at many different levels. And what's really problematic for Bordo is the way in which our bodies play an unwilling role in perpetuating this gap between the oppressed, the oppressor, and how that specifically shows up in anorexia. So she wants to argue that our bodies and our actions are actually greater symbols than what we say about women and femininity. Femininity itself has come to be largely a matter of constructing the appropriate surface presentation of the self. We are no longer given verbal descriptions or exemplars of what a lady is or what femininity consists. Rather, we learn the rules directly through bodily discourse, through images that tell us what clothes, body shape, facial expression, movements, and behavior are required. And this is a fairly modern phenomenon, as the increase of images in our society has just exploded by this era. So it really makes sense that we are educated more through visuals and through images than through words. And our bodies are actually one of those physical manifestations and symbols. So by now we kind of know that any sort of movement or revolution or change in society has always been a response to the previous movement, and this is no exception in terms of gender roles. So in the 1950s and 60s, in the post-war era, domesticity took over the woman's sphere again, and the woman's ideal role was seen more in the household. This idea of an independent woman with a career was really frowned upon. Now, as a response to this, which would be the mother's generation of those in the 80s, by Susan Bordo's time, women wanted to exert more freedom and independence. And so along with the first wave of feminism in this era, the ideals for both a woman's role in society and their body image also began to shift. In the 1950s and 60s, that hourglass Marilyn Monroe romantic voluptuous figure was still popular amongst women. But by the 1980s, that was being replaced with a more athletic, sculpted figure, getting closer and closer to that extremely slender body type that we'll see popularized in the 1990s. Even by the 1980s, eating disorders were becoming a huge issue amongst women. And that's because for Bordo, the idea of becoming quote-unquote athletic or muscular and the idea of simply losing fat or becoming slender were rooted in the same ideals of strict control over their bodies and the ideal of tightness. Women's dieting advertisements, as well as ideals specifically targeted certain areas of your body rather than your body as a whole. It was actually the shape of your body, whether it was thinner or thicker, and this idea that all the fat, all of the excess skin on your body and your flesh were completely controlled, it was toned, it was flattened down, and that there was nothing quote-unquote explosive. And the main source of these issues that Bordo cites is something she calls the double bind, placed on women particularly in this time, but I think can still be seen as relevant today, where the idea of traditional femininity, including a feminine body, just could not mesh in people's minds with the idea of traditionally masculine traits, particularly as seen in the workforce, seen as being powerful and strong and independent and assertive. And because of the wave of feminism going on, women really had this internal battle of still wanting to be desirable, fulfilling these expectations of femininity, as well as asserting themselves as someone who is just as capable as men in the workforce. We begin with a painfully literal inscription on the anorexic's body of the rules governing the construction of contemporary femininity. That construction is a double bind that legislates contradictory ideals and directives. And she calls this expectation an illusion because no one can actually meet both of these standards at the same time in the way that society perfectly wants them to. You're sort of asking us to be pulled in different directions with one body, one mind. And of course, I'm not saying that one person can't embody both of these traits, but the way in which they expected women to be these two things at once were unattainable, unrealistic, and yet it was so often depicted by media in these images of slender, athletic, very boyish figures on women who are also very powerful and yet somehow lovable, desirable. And I honestly think this phenomenon still exists today, where guys sort of have this fantasy or this romance of the perfect woman who both embodies the best of men and the best of women somehow. But this illusion is so well depicted in our image-driven society that it's really difficult to let go of these standards when it seems so attainable, when it seems like it's right there on screen. And how that manifests into anorexia, Bordo wants to call it a bodily protest. She says the anorexic is unaware that she's making a political statement, and yet she speaks through her body what she can't with words, what she can't vocalize, the suffering of the double bind that she feels from society and this desire to break free from it. For her, what makes anorexia stand out is the fact that it's a silent form of protest that is paradoxical to what she actually wants to accomplish. She wants to be given a voice, she wants to be given power, and yet the way that manifests through anorexia is such an image of powerlessness, is a cry for help, really, but a cry that doesn't speak at all, that doesn't use words. And just like historically women were always considered emotionally overwhelming and too much, women began to literally shrink themselves in order to be seen better. But the problem is that the idea just contradicts itself. You are seen less and less if you are physically smaller, and yet this seems to be the only way in which an anorexic mind can assert power over herself, can be seen and be heard. In this counterproductive sense, it actually reduces the woman to someone who is isolated and weaker, when in fact what she's really crying out for is strength. And Bordo believes that this gives us a sense of safety, a sense of security in entering a male's world. And I don't know if this is just me, I don't know if I'm still entrapped to these ideas, and that's why I think this way, but I do think there is a certain power seeing visually a woman who is tall, who is slender. Even now, there is a huge stigma against women of bigger sizes, which seems very odd. You would think that, oh, like a bigger woman would obviously seem more powerful. But in actuality, the bias against larger women as being more powerless comes from these historical roots of seeing the body as inferior, of seeing largeness as an inability for self-control and self-restraint. And this new modern diet culture is just another way that society is making our bodies the enemy. Whereas before, it used to be our carnal desires or our lack of self-control that we wanted to master and subdue. Now the enemy is fat. We want fat to be out of our lives, out of our bodies, and we see that as the antithesis of power, the antithesis of self-control and will. The double bind that I mentioned doesn't just stop at expectations of women in terms of their gender role. It also manifests in the solution. There is yet another double expectation that somehow we can have it all. We see both ads for amazing, delicious food. Right after that, we see ads for dieting and exercises. And Bordo calls it the duality of both the work ethic and the consumer that exists in all of us, and how media and advertisements try to pressure you into pursuing both. You have to be able to control yourself and you have to be diligent. But at the same time, you have to enjoy yourself and you have to consume these things. I mean, we all know that modern media perpetuates consumer culture, but the other side that we forget about is also how much it encourages work culture, strong ambitions, following your dreams, but to an extent that can be toxic. And somehow we are pressured to achieve both at the same time. And this is constantly reinforced in our generation through social media. And somehow, if we can't do both, then we are not sufficient. We are not good enough. And this is where I'll mention a couple other eating disorders, because for Bordo, bulimia is a way in which we try and have both. We try to both consume what we want as well as to exercise self-restraint. And that comes in the form of binging and purging. And I think this is where it really hits the nail that a lot of our issues with body image is about how we want to portray ourselves to others, not about the kind of person we really want to become. And I think there's a distinction there, because I'm not sure if a physical image is really equal to an individual person. I think that exterior image is something that's seen by others, but it doesn't really give you a sense of identity in who you are. Whereas for the anorexic, or on the opposite end of the spectrum, for what she'll depict as the obese, for these two categories, they're actually choosing a side. For the anorexic, they're choosing the side of restraint, or the binge eater, they're choosing the side of the consumer mindset, because there is really no way of reconciling the two in a healthy way. And so for Bordo, anorexia truly is a body's cry for help from the expectations, the double standards, the oppressions that women have felt throughout history, especially in these turbulent times where their gender roles and their identities are going through changes. The same way a girl going through puberty may feel much more pressure to really accept the changes that are in their body. Because of the social reforms within Bordeaux's time, women were really struggling to find their sense of identity and being grounded with these constant double messages being sent to them. So now, some of you will probably say, is this really relevant today in 2021? Aren't we kind of moving past that, even if we haven't moved on from it completely? Isn't the whole body positivity movement, the embracing of different sizes and bodies just becoming more prevalent? Aren't we doing a little better? And I want to say both yes and no. For me, as someone who has suffered through an eating disorder in the past, I want to say yes, it is still relevant, because ultimately eating disorders are not just related to our insecurity with our body. And it's not just about our weight or our size, but it's about being trapped in a culture that continues to prescribe certain ideals onto women, and how anyone of any size can become a victim to that. And I want to support this with some modern statistics, because I think that Foucault is right in that actions do speak louder than words. What we see, what we continue to see, as well as how we think and behave, matter much more than what we say on social media. We can say we support and embrace all body types all we want, and we can see it in ad campaigns, in marketing, and in different fashion brands. But what we see as those visuals, again, are not a depiction of reality. We have to ask these questions to real people and see how they respond. Not just people who are on social media, not just influencers, not just celebrities. Less than 6% of people with eating disorders are medically diagnosed as underweight. There are 10,200 deaths each year as a direct result of an eating disorder. That's one death every 52 minutes. People people in larger bodies are half as likely as those of a normal weight or underweight to be diagnosed with an eating disorder. 42% of 1st to 3rd grade girls want to be thinner. 35 to 57% of adolescent girls engage in crash dieting, fasting, self-induced vomiting, diet pills, or laxative. In a college campus survey, 91% of the women admitted to controlling their weight through dieting. In terms of our society's perception of body image, about half of Americans say that they feel pressure to have a certain body type. Women are 18% more likely than men to say that they feel completely or somewhat pressured to have a particular body type. 3/4 of US adults say that the media promotes an unattainable body image for women. 69% of Americans believe fashion companies have had a negative impact on the perception of body image. 44% of men find slimmer women attractive. 15% of men said that they don't prefer any body types. So the numbers aren't really showing what we're trying to promote and advocate for. The biggest indicator of how society's doing in terms of body image is not the ads, is not the body positivity campaigns. It's what we think and what we prefer. So you can say that you love and embrace all body types, but maybe you say in your head, I don't want that body type. I don't want my woman to have that body type. That's the question you need to ask. So I really hope that there are some new insights, some things for you to consider and take in from this video. And I hope this was just enjoyable and informative for you. Keep pondering those questions, just keep thinking about it. And if you want to do more research, I will definitely link my resources down below. And thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next episode.